All right. Well, let's let's jump right in here. Uh, Tonight, back to our narrative study and our focus on plot analysis. That's the fourth and last part of narrative analysis. And we introduced the topic last week of the plot. So let me just quickly remind us of the definition of what is a plot. Uh, and we had a more extensive discussion last week, but I just wanted to summarize for us to remind us. Plot of a story is it's a sequence of events, but the key is they're related to one another. Um, Again, you can have a story, you can have a not a story, a description of events that take place, but if they're not connected together in some way, then we really don't have a plot. A plot of a story is the writing of or telling or showing of events that take place that have a connection. That the author of the story uses the connection between those events to reveal the main point. All right, and so again, one can describe events that happen, but that doesn't mean there's a plot. There has to be that connection, that relationship between those events that the author intentionally describes uh, these events in a way that show us a point, show us a message of the story, and that's what we call the plot. Um, Here's a quote from E.M. Forster, who was talking about stories, and I think it's a helpful one. I was going to ask maybe Pastor Philip if you could read this for us, this quote.
Sure. We have defined a story as a narrative of events arranged in their time sequence. A plot is also a narrative of events, the emphasis falling on casualty. The king died and then the queen died is a story. The king died and then the queen died of grief is a plot. The time sequence is preserved, but the sense of casualty overshadows it.
Thank you. Yeah, what he's talking about here is the this word causality. That just means there's a connection between the events. And we used this example last week, but a story could be the king died and then the queen died, and he could add more detail. The king died of of a disease, and then the queen died from a heart attack or something like that. Those are describing events, but that's not a plot unless there's something in those events that show a connection. And so in the second example, the king died and then the queen died, and he adds of grief. That reveals a connection. Now we have a plot. There's a problem here that has taken place. That the king died, and the result of that, it caused the queen to die. So there's a connection. And so he says that the time sequence is preserved. All he means by that is, again, the sequence of the events hasn't changed between the first example and the second one. But in the second one, there's a connection that is given by adding this idea of grief to the events. And so that's really all the point I'm trying to make is a plot is shown by that connection. And then therefore the plot of a story is what leads us to understand the author's point of the story. And so like you may be talking to a friend or someone, and they're telling you things that maybe happened in their day, right? You may ask them, how did your day go today? And they may tell you of things that they did during the day, and they may tell you of how their day started and then what happened and what happened after that. And that is a story. That's just telling you things that happened. But if your friend has a point to it that he wants to tell you how it was a very good day, he may give a connection between those points. If there's a message he wants to communicate, um, in that telling of events, then when he'll tell them in a way they're connected together. So my day began. I had a wonderful breakfast with my wife, and we were able to spend time together. And then I had a friend who visited me and told me a very encouraging uh, update of his life. And so we began to tell events with an intention behind them to communicate a message, as opposed to just telling somebody what happened. Okay, so I don't mean to belabor the point or repeat it, but I think this is important to understand, because you will have narrative in scripture where sometimes, for example, uh, perhaps you may have a narrative, a description of something, but there may not be a plot behind it. For example, a particular vision in the prophetic book. The vision itself may not be a full story, um, but it may be connected in the broader book to a plot. But sometimes you'll have in a narrative a particular story that doesn't have a plot in itself, but it's connected to the bigger plot of the book. I'll try to explain that as we go through some examples together. Uh, so sometimes you may just have narrative elements like dialogue and characters and the setting, but you may not have a plot. Okay, and that's why I'm going through this. Often you do, and certainly in a full book like the Gospel of John, there's a plot for the entire book. But sometimes within John, there may be the smaller stories that are just part of that bigger plot. They don't have their own plot. But as well, sometimes there may be stories within the Gospel of John that do have a plot within that smaller story. So how do we know if it does? Well, let's keep going. I'll show you. All right. And let me do that, and then I'll ask if there's any questions. So let's consider first, what are the key elements of the plot of a story? How do I know I have a plot? What do I need to see within a story that shows me there's a plot, which then shows me there's a message that the author intends to tell me through that story, through those sequence of events? And the first part of the plot is usually there's an introduction. The characters and the setting are given. Once upon a time there was a young man who just started his job. Okay, now I'm getting some background now, that there's this about story about a young man, and he just got a job, and maybe it will tell me a particular period of time or a place. But we often see this in scripture. Stories are introduced by some opening situation that tells us something about where we are and when we are, and starts unfolding the characters to us. So that usually is at the beginning. We have an introduction to the story. And then not long after that introduction, we are introduced to a problem. Often the problem takes place early in the story, not always. And this problem is what helps us to see that there is a plot. That one day there was a young man who just began his job, and as he was working, his boss told him that he was fired. Oh, we have a problem now. What happened? Why did he get fired? He just started his job. What is it that took place? So a story, if it has a plot, is going to have a problem that takes place. All right. And so that's a conflict again, like some complication, some danger, some issue, some tension, something that is in the story that brings a problem to the main character. And then following that, we have what we call rising action. Okay, and rising action is usually the longest part of the story, and this is where the main character or characters in the story are trying to fix the problem, trying to get around the problem. They're trying to solve it in some way, and in many stories, that may cause other problems. So the young man who just began his job and then his boss fired him. He went to meet with the boss to try to understand why he was fired. And the boss got angry with him and they got in a fight and the young man had to go to jail. The police came. All right, so now the problem's getting worse. Right? So this is what can happen. That would be rising action. More things are happening as the he tries to solve his problem. Sometimes more problems come. And this is where, remember, we talked about the protagonist and the antagonist. Well, the antagonist is often the one that causes the problem in the story or makes the story worse. So this is a key element, is when the problem's introduced, then many stories will have a rising action of the main characters trying to solve the problem. And again, this is often the longest part of the story. And this is where authors of stories will draw it out as they try to develop the situation and the problem. All right. And so uh, we, as the reader, or if we're watching, if it's a story on a video or a movie, as we're reading or watching the story, we're wondering, okay, how is this problem going to be solved? What's going to happen? And that's where the rising action is really a big part of the story that's taking place. So, like for example, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? You have the the man who's traveling on the road, and what happens to him? Remember, he's beat up by robbers and left to die. And so here we have a problem that's introduced into the story. That first we have the story Jesus tells of a man walking on a road. That's sort of an introduction. And then the man is beaten, robbed, left for dead. Well, this is a problem. What's going to happen to this man? And then we have the rising action is the Levite walks by and he sees the man and avoids him. So the problem's still there. It's not solved. Then the priest walks by. The priest may help him, right? He's supposed to be a godly man. Well, he walks by and he goes to the other side of the road. So the problem isn't solved. The man's still there. And then, the Samaritan comes and he helps this man. And so this is all rising action in the story. Okay. And that rising action, in a typical story, that rising action leads us to the next part of a story, which is the climax of the story. This is when the problem reaches its worst. It's sort of I call it the turning point or the hinge of the story, right? We have another term called the cliffhanger. It's like you're at that point in the story where you're wondering, things get to their worst. Let's think of David and Goliath. All right, that's a well-known story. And we would say the introduction to that story would be when Goliath comes out and we're introduced to this giant, and the armies of Israel and the Philistines have gathered together. And so we get the setting there of who's involved, where it is, when it is. And then this giant comes out and he taunts the Israelites and he mocks the Israelites and their army. So this now is the problem. Okay, what are they going to do with this giant? He has challenged them to a fight. And are they going to fight? Or who's going to be the guy to stand up to this giant? And so this is the rising action. All right. And then David shows up, right? The young man David. And he says, I'll fight the giant. And right, his brother gets mad at him, and then the king, he meets the king, King Saul, and Saul puts his armor on him. This is all part of rising action. All right, what's going to happen? The giant's there now. This young man, David, said he's going to fight. Um, so the tension is building, right? Now, what will be the climax of that story? When does the tension reach its height? When is the where the turning point of that story? When is that? When would you guys say? Where's the climax to the story of David and Goliath? Anybody have an idea? Remember, the climax is where the tension or the problem reaches its highest point. The problem isn't resolved yet. It's where the problem reaches its peak, if you will.
The fighting between these two guys.
Yes, it's as David, rushes towards Goliath, right? And it says he runs towards him. He's got his sling. That's the climax. Okay, because here it is. They're gonna fight. What's gonna happen? Is this young David with just his sling and his stones? Is he going to win? Or it looks like he's not going to win. And so there's that. You're wondering. All right, this is the moment. Here's the battle. Oh, and so that's the climax. All right, that's where the height of tension, where the problem is. We wonder, is the problem now going to be solved? And effective stories actually may have multiple points where you think you're at the climax, right? Where you think, okay, now the problem's going to be solved, and then something else happens, and it gets worse, or doesn't change. But the actual climax of the story is that point where things turn. It's right before the turning of the story. That's why I'll often call it also a hinge. Or you can think of it like a peak. You're climbing this mountain, and right as you get to the top, you're ready to go down. That's the climax. Okay? So different, if you read books that talk about climax, sometimes you might see slightly different definition. Some call the climax is the point where the story is resolved or the problem is solved. But I like to think the climax is at where the problem is just before it gets solved. It's at that height. The next part is the resolution, or we might call it the falling action. That's actually when the problem is resolved. Okay? So the climax is that height of the story where it's the turning point. All right? We're wondering what's going to happen. Is this problem going to be resolved or not? The falling action is what we call the resolution, when the problem is resolved or figured out. So in the story of David and Goliath, the falling action would be when the climax is he's getting ready to fight Goliath. The resolution or the falling action would be the actual battle where Goliath is defeated. And he's defeated rather quickly, isn't he? One stone to the head, and then he falls. David cuts off his head. David somehow has won. That's the falling action. That's the resolution of the problem. And then there's more that takes place. He receives great fame, and he is praised by the king, and some of those things that take place. But that's the resolution or the solving of the problem. That's the falling action, we call it. Some people call it resolution. I like falling action because, again, you think of the climax as where like a peak of a mountain where the problem reaches its height, and then the falling action is the problem being solved. Now, in some stories, that falling action may take a while. There may be a number of things that happen to solve the problem. In David and Goliath, the falling action is very quick. The resolution is over very quickly. The giant is defeated. The armies of Israel pursue the Philistines, and they are victorious. And that happens in a very quick time. Now, there could have been the giant is defeated, but the Israelites take a long time to defeat the Philistines. So sometimes a falling action can be stretched out. That sometimes in a story the problem takes a little while to solve or to be resolved. But the falling action would be that resolution of the problem. Okay, and then finally, many stories may have what we call a conclusion. All right, that's where it's the end of the story. Sometimes there's closing remarks. They lived happily ever after, or Israel did not experience any more conflict, or sometimes there's this description of things that aren't part of solving the problem in the story. It just tells us, like in David and Goliath, at the end, it describes, that Saul asks about David and who his father is. And so that's what we call a conclusion. It's not part of the problem of the story or solving it, but it is connected to the story. And in biblical narrative, a conclusion is often used to connect or link that story to the next one. So that the author gives us information at the end of the story to now bridge to the next story, or to connect to the bigger plot of the whole book. Because David and Goliath, that story, there is a plot and a message in that story, but we have to remember that story is not isolated. It's part of the bigger narrative. And so David and Goliath gives us some information that's connected to the plot of the whole book of Samuel. Similar to, what came to my mind there? I had another example from John, Gospel of John, but I forgot. So this is what I was saying. Oh, like parables, like the parable of the Good Samaritan. There's a plot in that story. There's a sequence of events that are connected, that have a message. There's a problem in that story. There's a resolution to the problem in the story, but that story is connected to the broader narrative. That story was told by Jesus to make a point that was connected to a bigger story. In the case of the Good Samaritan, Jesus told that story in response to the Pharisees' question, "Who is my neighbor?" Do you remember? Those events. The lawyer, I think, questioned Jesus, is what is the greatest commandment, right? And Jesus said, "Well, you know the scripture. What does it say?" And the lawyer says, to love God with all your heart, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so Jesus says, "Yes, you're right." And then the lawyer says, well, who is my neighbor? Right? Testing Jesus. And so that's why Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. So there's a point to the story, but that story is not isolated. It's connected to a broader story, which was the question from the lawyer. And then that story then is connected to, in Matthew's gospel, the broader narrative of the whole Gospel of Matthew in some way. Okay? So, okay, I've said a lot. Any questions that come to your mind about this? Anybody?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, may I ask a question? What about suspense? Where should we put a suspense? Is it equal to problem?
Ah, great question. The suspense. You mean like the tension in the story, like what's
The
going to
question.
happen?
Yep.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I would put that in the rising action to the story, right? That's the part of the story where they're trying to overcome the problem. And this is usually where the tension is built up because you think, oh, now he's going to solve the problem. Oh no, this happened. So the problem is worse. So that would be the rising action would be the suspense. So in the story of David, the suspense comes when David says, okay, I'll fight the giant. And then you're thinking, wait a minute, David's this young man. How is he going to fight this giant? So that now the suspension, the tension is building because they're thinking, there's no way he could kill this giant. And then he goes out to get the stones for the sling, and you're thinking, how is that going to kill this big giant of a man? So that's the suspense, right? That Shulong's talking about. And that suspense comes in the rising action. Again,
Yeah.
does
Yep.
that make sense,
So
Shulong?
yeah, so that's the process of fighting between these two guys cannot be considered as a climax, the real climax, but it is only the suspense, right?
Yeah, the suspense is happening as the story progresses, and the problem is either getting worse or there's a process where they're trying to solve it. The highest point of the suspense is the climax. All right,
So
that's
the climax is Goliath fell down, right?
yeah. It's actually right at the moment David is rushing towards the giant.
Yep.
And is
When the
moving
stone
his
hits,
sling.
yep.
So the I would say the suspense is involved in that entire process of the rising action all the way to the climax where the suspense is at its highest. All right.
Yep.
So the point of highest suspense would be, right before that the problem is resolved, right at that climax. It's again like I don't know if any of you have ridden on a roller coaster, but you're sitting in the roller coaster and it's going up, 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 and you're going, oh, it's getting higher, and you're looking around. This is getting very high. What's going to happen? And right as you get to the top, that's the climax. That's the highest point of suspense because you're just getting ready to go over the top. So that's how I would think of it. So David and Goliath, I think the highest suspense point is right at the moment the battle begins because you don't know what's going to happen. Well, we know because we're familiar with the story, but let's say you're reading the story for the first time. You don't know what's going to happen. Will the problem be solved? And so that's that suspense. Now, a good storyteller will draw that suspense out. And if he's a good storyteller, he will make you think you're at the point of highest suspense, but actually he may draw that out and the problem may get worse or not get solved. Like on the roller coaster, you get right to the top and you realize I'm not at the top. It goes down a little bit, but then it keeps going up again. That would be an example of in a story where you think you're at the climax, you think you're at the point of the highest suspense, and then something else happens. Like maybe you're in a story and there's a a woman who's been kidnapped, and the 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 police are trying to find her, and they get a phone call, and someone gives them a tip that they heard a woman screaming in the apartment next to them, and so the police rush to the apartment. So you're thinking, oh, maybe now she'll be free, and they open the door, and there's no woman in there. It's a radio of a woman screaming on the radio. So, oh, they didn't find her. Okay, so now the problem's still there, right? You thought they were going to solve the problem because they're at the door. They're ready to rescue this woman. The police are, but you find out it's not her. And so then the story keeps going. Okay, so this is the suspense building, and that point in the story would not be the climax because the problem wasn't solved. You thought you were at the climax. You thought the problem was going to be solved, but it's like, oh no, it didn't. And then let's say the police get a phone call from the kidnapper saying, you thought you caught me. Now I'm going to kill her. Oh, now the suspense is really heightened. Oh, now she's going to. So this is what a good story, you'll have this suspense being drawn out, and you'll have the author make you think you're at the climax, but then something else happens. So that's still part of the rising action, by the way, in the story. So yeah, that's what makes effective stories, right? If the author's able to build suspense, to make us wonder, how is this problem going to be solved? And oh, it seems like it's going to be solved here. No, it's not. Oh, it's getting worse. Oh, now it seems like it's going to be solved. No, something else happened. Right? That's a technique often used, especially in like stories that are with a crime or a detective trying to solve a crime. Those are often drawn out, and the suspense is there, and that suspense is what makes us enjoy the story. So that's a key element, and I would put that suspense in the section of the rising action. Okay. All right. Any other questions related to that, or anything else on the key elements of the plot of a story? I like to present these elements visually. I think it helps at times to have a picture of them. Here, let me show this. So here would be a typical story. We'll have, as I said, the introduction. So that opens up, tells us the setting of the story, perhaps introducing the key characters, the time, the place, those kinds of things often come in the introduction. And then usually early in the story, we'll have the problem introduced into the story. And then we have the rising action in the story. That's where, again, as Shulong's question, that's where the suspense would come into the story of what's going to happen. How's the problem going to be solved? And when we get right to the point, just before really the climax, may be more something like right here, right at the point where the problem will be resolved. That's the climax. Then the falling action is also, as I said, the resolution to the problem in the story. And then sometimes you'll have a conclusion. Now, not every story will have all of these elements. Sometimes a story won't have a conclusion, or sometimes a story's introduction is very brief. But stories typically are definitely going to have a problem, a rising action, a climax, and a resolution. All right, that's what makes a story. And the plot of the story is the connection of those things to give us a message. That the author has a point in the story, and he shows that point by connecting these various events, by introducing a problem, and then showing how that problem is resolved. And in that, there's a moral to the story, a message to the story. Okay? And so here's a visual representation of those key elements. And really, I think understanding the problem of a story really helps us to determine or figure out its plot. That there's a problem and how that problem is resolved. That opens up to us, reveals to us the plot of the story. And so as you're trying to figure out, okay, what is the point of this story? What is its plot? How do I figure that out? Well, the way to do that is identify the problem in the story and how that problem gets resolved. And it's through that. So for example, the Joseph narrative, the problem in that story, right, is Joseph is unjustly, he's thrown into slavery, really kidnapped, sold into slavery, and then ends up in jail. I mean, the problem is introduced with, Joseph, this young man who is sold out by his brothers. Well, what's going to happen to Joseph? How is that problem going to be resolved? And of course, when he becomes second under Pharaoh, and he meets his brothers again, we see that's where that problem in the story gets resolved. But we realize the story of Joseph is actually part of a bigger narrative, that the problem of the story of Joseph isn't just Joseph and his brothers. It is this coming famine that could wipe out Jacob's family. And that would be a big problem in the larger plot of Genesis, because if Jacob's family dies, then how will God fulfill his promise to Abraham? Right? So this is the bigger problem that is resolved in the story. A problem, honestly, we're not made aware of till later in the story of Joseph. But we learn from Joseph himself. He says, "You meant it for evil, brothers, but God meant it for good in order to preserve your life." So that's a very well constructed story that Moses really cleverly puts together. Of course, they're real events, but how he connects it to the broader plot of Genesis, which is God making a promise to Abraham that he would be faithful to keep. But if Jacob's family dies, he can't keep that promise. And so Joseph, all that happens to him was part of how God was going to to save the lives of Jacob's family, so that he would keep his promise to Abraham and ultimately to us, right, through the Abrahamic covenant. So that's a good example, the story of Joseph, that there is a plot within the story of Joseph, God's sovereignty in the life of Joseph, but that story is part of the larger plot of Genesis, which is God's providence, sovereignty in the life of Joseph to preserve the life of Jacob's family, so that he would keep the Abrahamic covenant, keep his promise to Abraham. All right. And so our task, our job, our goal as Bible students, as we study narratives, is to identify the plot so that we could see what is the message of the author in the story, that the biblical message, the truth that he wants us to understand, and then how does that message fit in his larger narrative in the book as a whole. Okay, now there are many stories like Ruth or Jonah, which are self-contained. They're one story. Then there are the broader, like the larger, narratives, like the Gospels or the Pentateuch, which is a much larger narrative that has many stories within it that have their own plots, but are again linked to the larger plot of the book as a whole. And this is what makes narratives hard. This is what makes them difficult. In trying to find what is the author's meaning here, what is his message, what is he trying to tell us, what is the biblical truth that the author wants to show us through this story. All right, that can become a good challenge for us. But how we answer that question really is the plot of the story is what helps us. All that we've done so far, all 4 of these narrative analysis steps, the setting, the characters, the scenes, all of that is meant to help us understand the story so that we can see the plot of the story. That's why we do the plot last in these 4 steps. We first want to look at the setting of the story. So that's a broad, just the background of the story. Then we look at the scenes of the story. So we start breaking up the story into its pieces to understand each scene. And then we look at the characters of the story, the antagonist, the protagonist, the foils, God's what we see of God in the story, because all of that then helps us to, okay, now what is the plot? All of these things I've studied, they show me, they help me to understand the plot of the story. And it's the plot which is where we begin to see the author's message, because we identify the problem in the story, we see the rising action, the climax, the resolution, and through that, we learn, we discover the author's intended meaning, the point of his story. Okay? Questions on that or comments? We're gonna look to Genesis 22 as an example. We'll look at that in a minute, but I want to make sure we're clear on, as we consider the plot, what that is. So the plot analysis of a story is this. So these are the steps now for this 4th aspect of narrative analysis, where the first one is setting analysis, then we go to scene analysis, and then character analysis, and then the last is plot analysis. Okay? And for the plot analysis of a story, this is what we do. We first identify the plot details. That's what I've just talked about. Introduction, problem, rising action, climax, falling action. Those are all the plot details. So what we do in plot analysis, the first step is identify those plot details. Where's the introduction in the story? Where's the problem introduced in the story? What part of the story is the rising action? Where's the climax? What part of the story is the falling action? Those are the plot elements that you first want to identify. And then once you've done that, we go back now and again summarize the narrator comments that we discovered from the scene and character analysis that we did earlier. Okay, and because now we're looking at the narrator comments in light of the story as a whole, and also in light of the plot of the story. It's like, okay, now we step back and we say, okay, what statements does the narrator make that seem to show what the point of the story is. Often the narrator will make comments. He'll give insights that help us to discover, here's the problem in the story. Here's the climax, and here's the resolution of the story. So we look at the narrator comments now to try to understand how they connect to the plot of the story, and how through those comments he's showing us the point of the story. Okay? So we talk about the narrator comments in the scene analysis. And each scene we look at, okay, what does the narrator say here? Then when we get to the character analysis, we come back to the narrator, try to understand, okay, what are the comments from the narrator that seem important to the story as a whole? Well, in plot analysis, we come back to this and ask ourselves, okay, from what the narrator says from the story as a whole, what seems to help or point us to the plot of the story that the narrator communicates? Okay, so we're just revisiting the narrator's comments in the story, because again, the narrator is a very, very important part of the story, because he is telling us things from the story that he wants to make sure we understand or we see, because he wants, through his comments, he's guiding and directing us towards the point of the story. So we never want to miss what the narrator has to say. Now the author can use the dialogue and to reveal his point of the story, and often does, but we don't want to miss the narrator is the direct guidance or insight from the author to what's happening in the story. All right. And so in plot analysis, what we're looking for is, at this point, the narrator comments that seem related to the plot or point of the story. Okay. All right. And then the third part of the story is what is the point of the story reveal about God? And again, try to look for what the story may reveal from each member of the Trinity. Some stories we may have the Father, the Son, and the Spirit all at work in different ways. Other stories may just be one or two members of the Trinity. But here, again, we want to focus our attention on what God is doing in the story. What do we learn about God from the story? And what does God seem to be doing within the story to show us its main point? Okay, and then I often indicate, if I can see it in the story, if the Father's specific role and the Son and the Spirit. But sometimes you don't have all three clearly evident. You may just have one or two. And then finally, it's to take all the information now, everything that's been studied, all of the setting, characters, scenes, now plot, all of that comes together, and prayerfully, you put together and understand what is the author's point in the story. That's the fourth step. And often, to identify the point of the story, you need to be able to answer these three questions. All right. You need to be able to answer, how does this story connect to what came before? How does it connect to what comes after? And how does it connect to the purpose of the book? So, for example, if we're studying David and Goliath, and we see within that story, there seems to be a plot, right? There's a problem, there's rising action, there's a climax, there's then resolution of the problem. But that story is not isolated by itself. It's connected. It's part of the broader story of the book of Samuel. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, I can see the the plot of the story of David and Goliath, but how does this story, what happened before? What were the events that led up to this story of David and Goliath? And then what happened after the story of David and Goliath? And how does this story seem to connect to the whole book? All right, this is very important. If you can't answer those questions, and you really don't understand the point of the story of David and Goliath. All right. So as we think about that story, we need to think more broadly. Okay, what has happened so far in the book of Samuel? Of course, we have Hannah. She's at the beginning, and she's praying for a child, and Samuel is born, and she commits to have that child, be raised in the temple. So he's brought to the temple. Eli raises him, and then God speaks to Samuel when he was a young boy, tells him about Eli's sons and how God's going to bring judgment on them. And so we're being introduced. We have not yet been introduced to the problem in the book as a whole yet. This is all part of really the setting up of that problem. And then Samuel grows into a man. He becomes a great prophet, a judge in Israel. And then the people of Israel, they don't want they don't want his sons to be judge over them. The sons are bad guys. And so they say, we want a king. Now we're beginning to see a problem introduced in the book of Samuel. We want a king like the other nations. All right, this is an issue. This is a problem. The people are demanding now a king like the pagan nations around them. And so God tells Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. We're beginning to see, here's the problem in the story. How is this God going to resolve this problem of the people wanting a pagan king, and in that desire, they're rejecting really God's rule over them, right? Because God ruled through the judges. Remember, he ruled through Moses and then Joshua, and then came the time of the judges when he would send a judge to deliver them. And so God would rule directly through that judge. Well, now they're at Samuel, and they don't want that anymore. They want a king. So can you see a problem here in the book? So how is this going to be resolved? What's God going to do? Well, he raises up Saul, because that's the kind of king the people want, right? It says in 1 Samuel 10 or 9 or 8, I can't remember now, that Saul was handsome, that he was taller than everybody else. He looked like a king, right? And when Samuel introduced him, the people said, that is a king. Look at him, right? So it seems like, problem is solved. God finds this King Saul, who's the guy that the people want. But the problem isn't resolved, because we learned Saul's not a good guy. There's the story where he makes the sacrifice. He doesn't wait for the priest to come. He makes the sacrifice himself, which Samuel told him not to do. And then later, he does not destroy the Amalekites like Samuel told him to do, or God through Samuel, right? That's in 1 Samuel 15. And so we begin to learn this man Saul, he's not a good man. He's not a godly man. He doesn't fear God. And because he's the kind of man the people wanted. He's not the man God wanted. All right, so Saul actually just increases the problem in the story. as he's become king, and now he's a bad king. And even when we get to David and Goliath, what has happened right before that? 1 Samuel 16, right? 1 Samuel 15 was Saul not killing the Amalekites like God said. And so Samuel tells him, God will take the kingdom from you and give it to someone else. Well, 1 Samuel 16, God sends Samuel to the house of Jesse to find the next king. And this king would be the king God wants. King Saul was the king the people wanted. Now, here's what's interesting. Let me show you something from 1 Samuel 16. And actually, I'm going to have 1 Samuel 16. Let me start with, I think it's 8, 1 Samuel 8. No. Yeah, this is the part, 1 Samuel 8, when the people said, right, give us a king to judge us, right? We want a king to judge us like all the nations. Again, I would say this is the point in the story where the problem is revealed. The problem in the book of Samuel is the people demand a king like the nations. All right, you see that 1 Samuel 8, verse 5. And then God says, look, Samuel, listen to the people in regard to all that they say to you. They have not rejected you, they've rejected me. All right, this is why it's a problem here. Okay, so then God directs Samuel to the kind of king the people wanted, right? Samuel tells the people, wait, you're rejecting God. Why are you doing this? And the people say in verse 19, we want a king that we may be like the nations. We want a king like the nations. So Samuel says, okay, you'll get what you want. And then notice Saul is introduced in the very next chapter. And notice how he's described. There's a man named Kish of the Benjamites. He had a son whose name was Saul, a choice and handsome man. There was not a more handsome person than he among Israel. From his shoulders and up, he was taller than any of the people. Now, why do you think the narrator says that? Why is he describing Saul's looks? Well, what had just happened? The people said, we want a king like the nations. That happened in the story just before. And then God says, okay, Samuel, give them what they want. And then the first description of Saul is his looks. That on the outside, he looked like a king of the nations. Ah, yes, handsome, tall, choice man. This is the guy, right? And then, of course, we have the story of how Saul is introduced to Samuel. He's looking for the donkeys. And then Saul anoints him, saying, okay, you're going to be the next, you're going to be the king. You're going to be the ruler, right? And then he tells him, go back to his home. And then Samuel wants to bring Saul to present him before the people. All right. Now, again, pay attention to what the narrator says. All right. So here Samuel called the people together. And Samuel again rebukes the people, saying, you've rejected your God. Okay, here's the problem. And it's brought up again by Samuel. You've rejected the God who saves you from all your calamities and your distress, right? He sent judge after judge to rescue you, but you reject God. You said, we want a king. So, okay, here you go. brought all the tribes together. Saul was chosen. And notice, by the way, Saul is hiding. We're getting a little glimpse of his character here. And again, verse 23 of 1 Samuel 10. They got Saul, they stood him among the people. And notice again what the narrator says. Saul was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. So Saul was like a head taller than everybody. Why does the narrator point that out? And again, notice, what does Samuel say? Ah, do you see him whom Yahweh has chosen? Look at this guy. Surely there's no one like him. And all the people said, yes, yes, long live the king. This is the guy we wanted. Look at him. He is handsome. He is tall. He is kingly, just like the nations. Ah, right? You see what's happening here. Then we get chapter 11. Saul begins to perform his kingly duties, and he defeats the Ammonites. But as I mentioned, he goes to Gilgal, and Saul offers the peace offerings there. And he wasn't supposed to do that. That was something that was only to be done. Let's see, was it chapter 12? Uh, 11 or 12 where he does that. Ah, sorry, 13. Sorry, 13. Right, Samuel had told Saul to go to Gilgal and wait for him, and Samuel never showed up, and so Saul says, okay, I'll do the burnt offering to the Lord. Right? Saul said, bring me the burnt offering. So he did that. So again, we should be thinking, why is this story here? What's the author doing? Why is he telling us about this? Well, he finishes the burnt offering that he wasn't supposed to do. That was for the priest. That was not for Saul to do. And Samuel says, what are you doing? I told you to wait. You've acted foolishly. You've not kept the commandment of Yahweh. Now your kingdom will not endure, right? Why is this story here? It's begin to showing the character of Saul, that he's not a good guy. He looks like a good guy. He's the kind of guy the people wanted, but inside, in his heart, he's not for God. He doesn't fear God. And so he does this thing. And then that's why we get to chapter 15. There's yet another example where Samuel told Saul to kill the Amalekites because that's what God wanted, and Saul didn't do it. Right? He didn't kill all of them. He kept things that he wasn't supposed to. And then we have the famous event where Yahweh tells Samuel, I regret I made Saul king. He's turned back from following me. Saul is not a good guy. And then Samuel confronts Saul and tells him, you've not obeyed the voice of the Lord. And let's see, where is it? Here it is. Samuel said, right, has Yahweh as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice. And then he says, because you've rejected the word of the Lord, he's rejected you from being king. And then Saul says, oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. No, it's too late. Samuel says, you've rejected God again. And so what's all this doing? We haven't gotten to David yet. Notice we're 15 chapters into Samuel, and the main character in Samuel hasn't been introduced yet. Why is that? What's going on here? All of the first 15 chapters are building. The problem's been introduced, but they're building towards how is this problem going to be solved? The people wanted a king like the nations. God gave them one, and he's not a good guy. 1 Samuel 16. God tells Samuel, go to the house of Jesse because my king is there. The one I want is there. All right. And so he goes to the house of Jesse, and then notice what he says. Here I'm going to ask Daniel, if you could read, this is 1 Samuel 16, verses 6 through 10. Could you read that for us? Brother Daniel, would you be able to read that for us?
Okay. Okay. Now it happened when they entered, he looked at Eliab and thought, surely the anointed of Yahweh is before him. But Yahweh said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but Yahweh looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, Yahweh has not chosen this one either. Next, Jesse made Shammah pass by. And he said, Yahweh has not chosen this either. Thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, Yahweh has not chosen these. And Samuel said to Jesse, are these all the young men? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, and behold, he is shepherding the sheep. Then Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not turn around until he comes again. Shall I read until 14 or here?
Let's stop there.
13.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So notice here, this is again, we have to be asking, okay, why is he telling us about this? Why doesn't he just tell us, okay, Samuel went to the house of Jesse and found David and anointed him? Why all of this other dialogue about the other sons being brought forward? Why is he doing that? Well, did you notice, how did Samuel respond when the first son came into the tent? Right, you have the picture the scene, right? We've got Samuel arrives, okay, and he greets Jesse, and then Jesse invites him to sit, and then he introduces his first son, right? When the sons entered, he looked at Eliab, the first one, and what does Samuel say? Did you catch that? Ah, look at this guy Eliab. Surely that's the one. Well, wait a minute, Samuel. Do you know anything about Eliab? Right? The only thing is, he just looks at him and he says, he looks like the guy. Now, what's the problem here? How could Samuel know by looking at Eliab that he was the man God wanted? Because remember, Saul looked like a good king, didn't he? Handsome, choice man, taller than anyone else. But you see, Samuel fell into the same trap as the people. You see that here? Just that small remark revealed Samuel was looking at the outside, not the inside of the man. And this was the problem with Saul. On the outside, he looked good. But his problem was on the inside, wasn't it? And that's exactly what God tells Samuel. Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature. Remember, Saul was described twice as a tall man. Remember that? So now here, Yahweh tells Samuel, hey, don't look at his outward appearance. Saul looked good on the outside. But I rejected Eliab. Eliab's not the one, because God sees not as a man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance. Yahweh looks at the heart. Okay. We're beginning to see here some important insights into what the author wanting us to see in the story. Okay, people reject Samuel's sons, but they're rejecting God. They want a king like the nations. God introduces to them Saul, who looks like a king like the nations, but he is inwardly doesn't fear God. He's a bad guy. But on the outside, he looks like a good king. And Samuel falls into the same trap. He just looks at Eliab. Remember, that's all he does. He just sees the guy and he says, this guy looks like a king. But God rebukes Samuel and says, no, don't look at the outside. That's what man looks at. Look at the inside. And then we're led to David. David is the one God chose. Saul is the king the people wanted. David is the king God wanted. And guess what? The book of Samuel is basically about King David showing this is the man God wants versus Saul, the man that the people wanted. Because what happens after this? What's the first story? We have David being made Saul's armor bearer. All right. But David is not yet, that he's introduced in the story here, but we don't hear anything about David. We're just told that he became the one that would play music for Saul to calm him, right? Again, realizing Saul's a bad guy. He's tormented by evil spirits. Then comes chapter 17. Then comes the story of Goliath and David. And in this story, we see David speak for the first time. Okay, again, the story introduces the problem, the setting here, the introduction. The Philistines have gathered for battle. Then Goliath, who is over 9 feet, he's over 3 meters high, is there, and he's huge. His armor's huge. His spear is huge. This guy is fierce. He's scary. He openly challenges the Israelites. And then notice David now comes to the front lines to bring food for the Philistines. For the his brothers who are going to fight the Philistines. Okay, and then Jesse tells David, "Take your brothers this food." And he brings this to his brothers in the morning. Again, David hasn't said anything yet. He's just being given instructions. All right. And then he finds out about Goliath. And look at verse 26. Here's the first words out of David's mouth in the book of Samuel. What will be done for the man who strikes this Philistine down and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should reproach the battle lines of the living God? Those are the first words David speaks in the book of Samuel. And what did they reveal about David? Hey, somebody needs to deal with this guy. He is blaspheming. He is slandering. He's attacking the very armies of God himself. What's David's concern? Right? He's concerned about really the glory and integrity, the character of God here. And then Eliab, the oldest brother. Remember, he's the guy that Samuel said he looks like a king. He's introduced in this story and he's rebuking David. Isn't that interesting? Okay, again, I think that's intentional. The author includes this, that Eliab, who is, again, the guy that Samuel first thought, oh, he looks like a king. Well, he actually turns out to be, he's an opponent too to God's plans here. And then, of course, we have David then fights Goliath and defeats him. Saul didn't, right? Who should have been the man to stand up to Goliath? Should have been Saul, right? He's the king. He was taller, bigger than anybody else. But he did not. Just like he was hiding in the baggage when Samuel was looking for him to anoint him. He's again basically hiding. He's not willing to fight, but this young man David is. So, again, how is this connected to what's come up to this point? Well, the problem in the story, the people rejected Samuel. They rejected God as their king. They wanted a king like the nations. And then the rest of the story is the unfolding of, here's the kind of man that the people want. Here's the kind of man that God wants. And that makes 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, a key verse in the whole book, where God says, don't look at the outside, look at the inside. God looks at the heart. And then the rest of the story demonstrates God's solution to the problem. He gives them a king, but he gives them the king he wants. All right, because again, think about the rest of Samuel, at least the first part of 1 Samuel, is Saul now is attacking David. He wants David dead. And so we see this contrast between God's man and the people's man through the book of Samuel. And then finally, God's man becomes king, and we see the reign of David described in the rest of Samuel. And so really, David and Goliath is connected to the broader picture because it's showing us the contrast between God's man and the people's man. God's man is zealous for the glory of God. God's man is offended when God is blasphemed or spoken against. God's man shows courage and will fight for God in boldness and faith. All right, but the people's man, he is not concerned about God's glory in his character. The people's man is corrupt and doesn't fear God inside. The people's man is a man like Saul. And so we see in the story of David and Goliath this contrast between God's man and the people's man. What does God's man do? What does the people's man do? All right, well, that was a long example, but I hope that helps you to see, really, you want to understand, yes, we look at the smaller story, the story of David and Goliath, and we can see the plot there and what's happening, but don't disconnect it from what's happened before and what the purpose of the book is. And I believe the purpose of the book of Samuel is 1 Samuel 16:7. Man looks at the outside, God looks at the heart. And in the story of David, David is, again, he's called a man after God's own heart. All right. Yet, yes, later on, David's going to do some terrible things to show that he's still just a man. But really, the point of the book of Samuel is not just the story of David the king, but the story of how David the king shows the kind of man God wants versus the kind of man that the people want. Because again, you have to ask yourself, why does Samuel have all those stories about how Saul's trying to kill David? chapter after chapter. Well, again, I think he's showing us the character of Saul versus the character of David. Saul wants David dead. David doesn't kill Saul. He's given the opportunity twice. But he doesn't kill Saul. Why? He says, oh, Saul is God. God made Saul king. It's not, I am not, I cannot touch the Lord's anointed. It's not up to me to kill the king. That God has to do that. Because this is the man God put in authority. So we see the character of David even revealed there in contrast again to Saul. Saul wants to kill the man he knows God has appointed as king. David will not kill the man that God has appointed as king. Again, we see that contrast. So we need to understand each of the stories in the book of Samuel and how they connect to each other, and then how they connect to what the point of the book is and the plot of the book of Samuel is overall. And again, all of that is leading to 2 Samuel 7, where the Davidic covenant, where God promises David he will have a son to reign on his throne forever. And that now links to the narrative of the Bible in the revelation of the Messiah. In this case, through the line of David, we learn from from the book of Samuel. Okay, long illustration or example, but does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that, or what comes to your mind is from that example as we talk about plot and the point of the story and how do the stories connect together to the purpose of the book? Any questions? Or any additional thoughts, insights that you have, or things that came to your mind? Okay, well, I'll take that to mean either it's very clear or it was too long and you're ready for bed. But I had hoped we could get to Genesis 22 tonight, but maybe the Lord wanted us to wait for you, Chai, so he could have his question answered. So maybe, Lord willing, next week we'll move immediately to Genesis 22 and look at that story and understand its plot, and then talk about this very thing, that how is Genesis 22 linked to the broader book? Because you have to be able to answer both questions. If you're studying, teaching a narrative, you have to understand not only what the plot of that narrative is, but how does that fit in the broader story? You're not ready to preach it until you can answer that question. How does this story fit with what came before and what comes after? How does it fit with the broader story and purpose of the book overall? You've got to be able to answer those questions, or you're not ready to teach that story, because you won't understand what the author's point is to that story. Okay? And I know I brought this point up before a few times, but I just want to reinforce it because this is really, really important in understanding narratives, but then also in teaching narratives. You want to be able to connect it to the broader narrative as well, the purpose of the book as a whole. Okay? All right. Well, any final thoughts or questions? Brother Daniel, did you have something you were gonna?
No, just saying that it'll take us some time to digest all that you have shared. Since you took us on a long journey, we'll have to think through carefully.
Yeah, I originally did not intend to do that, but
Yeah.
I think Samuel, it's a good example of just really David and Goliath to me is such a, it's a famous story, right? Everybody knows it. It was my favorite story as a kid. I would read it all the time. I just thought it was so great, right? And
Yeah,
even in the world, David and Goliath, many people know that story.
Yeah.
Even non-religious people, because it's
That's
just
right. Yeah.
it's a great story, right? The story of this young of a impossible task, and this young man defeating this giant.
Mm. Mm.
So, but it's a story that is very often misunderstood and very often not interpreted correctly. And, a bunch of it's made into just this story about David, and the bigger picture of what God wants to show us through David is missed. And really that, and I see stuff, David and Goliath, where David is Jesus and Goliath is Satan. And, there's just all this stuff. And it's like, wait a minute, wait, hold on. As opposed to, here's an example of what God's man looks like in contrast to the people's man. And what is it that God wants us to see, through the author who wrote the book? What is it he wants us to see and learn from this story? So that's why I think it's a good example for us to think about trying to, when we want to interpret it, just being careful that we don't turn it into a story or turn it into what we think it should mean based on what we see. But really, we want, again, to discover what is the author trying to show us here.
I was wondering whether there's a subplot there. I mean, from chapters 16 to 17. I don't know, because I was looking at the part where 16 verse 14 onwards, until the end of chapter 16, that is a subplot or something like that. It just occurred in my mind. Not fully digested it yet.
Yeah. Yeah, there's, I think, connection there, right? Where we have this, we identifying, that Saul is a man God has rejected.
Yeah.
Because he's externally he looks good, but internally he doesn't fear God. And he gave examples of Saul's disobedience 3 times, 3 examples of where Saul's character was exposed.
Yeah.
And so now we have, God departs from Saul and he's tormented by this evil spirit. And now David is introduced as the one who's, and again, this is very interesting, right? Why does the author include this story about David, about Saul being tormented by an evil spirit, and David being the one that God uses to comfort him?
So I thought maybe a subplot.
Yeah, there's definitely connection. And we just have to think about, here is this story in 14 to 23. Maybe it's connected to the broader with David and Goliath, but I think it's just by itself. There's a problem here. Saul is terrorized by an evil spirit, and the problem is solved by David coming to play his harp for him, to soothe him. Then you think about, okay, how does that connect to the broader picture of what happened earlier in 1 Samuel 16, what happens later in 1 Samuel 17, and then what God is doing in the whole story? So again, that's why I take us to really what led us to this whole illustration, or led me to give it, is you're trying to answer the question of how the story you are studying is linked to the story or stories that came before. How is it linked to the stories that come after? How is it connected to the purpose of the book? Those are the three
Yeah.
questions that require an answer. And if you can answer those three questions, then you understand the point of the story. You understand how it fits. And so that's why this is the last step of plot analysis, which is the last step of narrative analysis, right? Where you're bringing everything together, all that you've studied from a narrative perspective, all that study you've done on the setting, the characters, the scenes, the plot. You're bringing it all together to identify the author's main point. And to do that means you understand how the story fits with what's before, what's after, and with the book as a whole. Then now you understand the story's point from the author. And that's our goal. All right? Okay. Well, I can see you're tired.
Yeah.
You're given a lot of information here to think about at the end of the day. But we did record this, so if you want to go back and take a look, and I'll put some notes together and send to you as I usually do, so you can maybe revisit this when your mind is fresh. But this is really all that we've discussed and talked about, and all that I've taught is leading us to this very point of understanding the point of the story and how do we get there. And this is really, so this is tonight was the climax of our study of narratives, where we come to that point of really grasping, okay, what does the author want us to know, and how do we find that out? How do we learn that? So, okay, well, let me ask Pastor Philip if he could close us in prayer and send you guys to your rest for tonight.